Hello, welcome to tonight's event of the Maryland STEM Festival. Tonight we're talking about a topic that has been quite in the news lately, although it's always been a major issue. It's just getting to the general public in many instances. Tonight we're talking about wildfires, and we have five experts, five people who work in the field, five people doing research to talk about that topic. We'll start by going around the table and asking each person to introduce themselves and tell them where they work and a little bit about what they do. So I'll start with Arnaud.
Yes, hi, I'm Arnaud Trouvé. I'm a professor in the Department of Fire Protection Engineering at the University of Maryland in College Park. I teach engineering courses related to fire, and I also, for my research, work on the computational modeling, numerical simulation using computers of fire dynamics.
Thank you, Arnaud. Peter, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Peter Sunderland, also a professor at University of Maryland in Department of Fire Protection Engineering, and I teach a lot of classes in fire and do research on different aspects of fire, especially firebrands and microgravity fire safety.
Thank you, Peter. And just to add, and you'll be talking about that later, Maryland has a very unique program in fire safety and engineering. So Arnaud and Peter will be talking about later, and several people on this panel are graduates of that program. So I will now like Christine to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Christine Pongratz. I am also a graduate of University of Maryland of 2013. I am working for Jensen Hughes. I'm a wildfire engineering consultant and work in the mitigation measures side of wildfire.
Thank you, Christine. Eric, can you please introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Eric Link. I'm a research engineer at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, also known as NIST, and I work in the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Group, where we do all sorts of research related to wildfires as they impact communities. And specifically, I work on case studies after wildfires and some lab work, including firebrands and structure ignition from wildfires.
Thank you, Eric. And Lance, please introduce yourself.
My name is Lance Carroll. I work for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Forest Service. I do the FireWise program and wildfire risk and reduction, and also do fire suppression and fire investigation for wildfires.
Thank you. So we've got a number of topics related to discussing the fire safety issue, and oops, went a little bit too far. Sorry about this. Okay, I will be calling up the first slide. We'll be talking about what is wildfire. And let me pull up the slide. All right. Okay. So Arnaud, can you please go through your slides?
Yes, thank you, Phil. I want to provide a brief introduction to the problem of wildfires. So first, let me start with some basic concepts. So what is a fire? A fire is a combustion reaction, a chemical reaction between hydrogen and carbon atoms that are contained in what we call the fuel that burn through this chemical reaction with the oxygen from air. So the chemists call this an oxidation reaction. And what's unusual about combustion is that it is an oxidation reaction that releases very large amounts of heat. What is a wildfire? Well, a wildfire is a fire that occurs in the natural open environment, and that is fueled by wildland vegetation, what we also call the biomass. A wildfire is a fire that occurs in the open, that is burning this biomass, and that is driven by a number of factors. So one of the factors, of course, is the vegetation itself. There is no wildfire in the desert. A second factor is the meteorological conditions, the wind, the aridity. There is no wildfire after on rainy days or under humid conditions. And finally, the last factor is the topography. It is known that a fire spreads faster moving upslope and slower moving downslope. So the topography of the terrain and the slope of the terrain in particular has a big impact on fires. So next slide, please. So a brief mechanistic point of view on why a fire spreads. A fire spreads as a repeated cycle of heat transfer from a source that is hot to a target, which is a virgin fuel that is not ignited yet. And because of this heat transfer, the temperature of the target is going to increase up to a critical level of about 300 degrees Celsius, or about 572 degrees Fahrenheit. And then ignition occurs. Ignition is defined as the start of the release of flammable vapors from the target to the air environment. And these flammable vapors are going to start burning for a combustion process with the oxygen from the ambient air. So, and this cycle can be repeated, and that explains flame spread. And flame spread is associated not only with the displacement of the leading edge of the fire due to ignition, this ignition process that is repeated that I just described, it is also characterized by the displacement of the trailing edge of the fire due to the burnout of the vegetation fuel. So as it spreads, a fire is always characterized by a certain surface area where it is active. There are different modes of heating that explains the repeated ignition cycle that I just described and explains the spread of the fire. You have thermal radiation, which is a long-distance heating process. Think about being on the beach and on the nice sunny day and about the heat provided by the sunshine. That's thermal radiation. A second possible mode for the heating process is flame contact. This is a short-distance heating process. Think about the heat that is contained in the flame. The temperature inside the flame can be up to about 1800 degrees Celsius or 3272 degrees Fahrenheit. Think about that heat. If you put your hand or put a piece of plastic inside the flame, you're going to see that plastic melting and you're going to have to take your hand away from the flame very rapidly. So flame contact is a mechanism for flame spread. And finally, there's a third, probably more dangerous way of spreading the fire, which is associated with firebrands. This is another long-distance heating process. Think about the embers that are flying away from a campfire. Now, these embers are usually small and are going to self-extinguish fast, so it is not a threat when you have a campfire. But when you have a large wildfire, you have many of these firebrands that are going to be transported far and are going to remain hot enough for a long time, and they can ignite a fire at their landing location. Finally, the factors that promote fire spreads are kind of obvious. It's dry vegetation that is going to promote faster ignition, high wind velocities that is going to promote faster heating in case of flame contact, and is also going to increase the generation of firebrands. And finally, upslope terrain, because we know that flames propagate faster when they go upslope, primarily because of the increased flame contact. Next slide, Phil. Thank you. So what is the impact of wildfires? Well, clearly, fires are a threat to human life. Wildfires are a mechanism to destroy structures in the built environment. Another negative impact of wildfires is the relief of smoke. Something that I forgot to mention in my slide here is greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that is emitted by wildfires. Aerosols in terms of the black content of the smoke, toxic chemical species. So in short, this release of smoke is bad for human health, bad for the air quality, and bad for the climate through the emission of greenhouse gases. So megafires, these large wildfires are called megafires, have a long-term negative impact on ecological system. Something that we realize now is that low-intensity surface fires are healthy for the ecological system that you find in the wildland, whereas high-intensity ground fires that burn the trees are unhealthy. And so the megafires, the large megafires, are unhealthy for the environment. Next slide, Phil, please. So what is the problem? Well, I think we all know that the problem is of wildfires is increasing in size and intensity. There are in that list, you can see highlighted in yellow, 14 of the top 20 fires in California have occurred in the past 10 years. Okay. And one thing I want to mention, if you look at the top 2 fires in this list, they have both consumed on the order of 1 million acres. Now, 1 million acres doesn't speak that much to me, but it represents about 1% of California. So these mega fires are capable now of burning, a single mega fire burning 1% of the surface area of the state of California. So that gives you an idea of the size of the problem. Next slide, please. So why are wildfires a growing problem? Wildfires are a growing problem because people are moving and building structures and communities into the wildland, thereby creating a new landscape that is called the Wildland-Urban Interface, WUI, the WUI. And this landscape is exposed to the threat of wildfires, and that threat has been reduced in urban areas, in cities and towns through the firefighting stations. So that's part of the problem. Next slide. A second reason why wildfires are a growing problem is the accumulation of vegetation, which is the fuel for the combustion process on the landscape. And this is in part due to past land management practices of systematic fire suppression and our failure to recognize that the role of fire in the natural ecological process. So again, small fires are healthy, large fires are unhealthy, and these small fires are required to clean up the vegetation and prevent the risk of wildfires. So we had a failure to recognize the difference between a low-intensity surface fire that is healthy for the ecological system and a high-intensity ground fire that is unhealthy because it burns the trees. Next slide, please. And finally, and this will be my last slide, why are wildfires a growing problem? Well, because of climate change. So climate change, also known as global warming, is creating conditions of severe heat waves and drought events that are going to promote wildfires, are going to create conditions that are favorable for wildfires. Now, wildfires in turn are going to release carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and are going to increase the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that will trap the heat emitted by the planet and promote global warming. And so you see that through wildfires, you have a dangerous positive feedback and a dangerous positive feedback loop that make wildfires a significant part and a growing part in the climate change problem. So that explains the importance of wildfires. So I will stop here. Thank you, Phil.
Okay. Why did it? Okay, hold on one second. Okay, thank you very much, Arnaud. Now, Eric is going to be discussing a case study to show the issues of wildfire. And let me get to his. All right, and you are number 2.
Thank you, Phil. So to expand a bit about the problem of wildfire, as Professor Trouvé introduced to us, one of the large impactful ways that wildland fires impact people and life safety is when they burn towards communities. And one recent example of that was in 2018 in Northern California in the Camp Fire. And so what we see in the right side is an animation of data that I was a part of a team collecting to see how did this Camp Fire impact the communities in California. And overall, we see a very significant impact to the local community, where 85 people were tragically killed by the fire as it burned through the town of Concow and Paradise and Magalia. And in the process, it damaged or destroyed almost 20,000 structures. And that includes 13,000 single-family homes that were burned during the fire. And it also influences the commercial structure. So over 500 businesses and commercial structures were destroyed from this fire, which required the evacuation of 50,000 residents early in the morning, just after they had woken up. Beyond that, there was a destruction of critical infrastructure. The water system was damaged and largely destroyed. That power lines and the power system was destroyed, large part, and other important things like the community hospital. A very important aspect of a community was also destroyed, and so these damages to the infrastructure create ripple effects throughout the local community, make recovery and rebounding from these instances very difficult and challenging. Beyond the structural devastation, there's destruction of the environment and the habitat, ecological values, and other things like timber, which is a large business in the area. Impacts extend far beyond the local community too as well. Arnaud mentioned smoke exposure, and in the case of the Camp Fire, smoke exposure extended hundreds of miles throughout Northern California and San Francisco Bay Area, impacting millions of people. And so this is one of the case studies that is ongoing at NIST, where I work. And you can see a QR code here to our current study. If you're interested in more information about the Camp Fire, I encourage you to check out that link there. You can also find the text link at the bottom of the slide. Phil, you can go to the next slide for me, please.
Oops, sorry.
Yep. So the Camp Fire is just one of the case studies that the NIST Fire Research Group has done, starting back in 2007 in California was the first one. Followed that up in Texas and in Colorado with other impactful wildland fires as they impacted communities. And so while the Camp Fire was large and had a very dramatic impact on communities, and we hear a lot of the news about California and the states out west like Oregon and Washington and Colorado, the wildland fire problem is actually a national problem. There's over 46 million residents in the United States that are at risk of wildland fire. And since 2005, over 2,000 fires have destroyed structures and over 89,000 structures have been destroyed. So at NIST, we're very interested in how can we learn from these fires to study them and direct our research to improve safety of people and property. And some of the things that we have learned is about how structures ignite from these fires. What can we do to make structures safer? How does fire spread through different communities? Things like detached combustibles once the wildlands burn up into the community. Things like fences, which are everywhere if you think about it, and often are made out of wood, can further bring the fire into the community, and then structures start burning, and then they burn to each other. And the firefighters try really hard and do a great job at defending people and structures in these fires. But when they get so large, it's virtually impossible to keep up. And so they do a tremendous job, and what they do has a significant impact on the outcome of the fire in regards to life safety and structure safety. So the next slide, please, Phil. So how can STEM help the problem of wildland fire? And so I'm going to start off with an example here, and then Peter is going to follow up with some additional research that's being done at the University of Maryland. But at NIST, in the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Group, we are looking to develop, advance, and deploy measurement science to reduce the risk of fire spread in these communities. And what does that mean? We're looking to use science and technology to to either reduce the exposure of fires, so to make the fire less dangerous when it gets to people and communities and structures. And we can harden structures. So using the latest science and information about how the fire spreads with different materials, different construction practices, to make structures more resistant to fire from the outside. And so these are the two options we have to make things safer. And we're doing that in a various different projects. We see a few pictures here of current research that we're doing at NIST. We have the campfire case study, which I mentioned. We have the research on detached combustible hazards. So we see a picture here of fences burning, and we look at how fire can impact structures and what firebrands, the little embers that come from this fence, do when they travel down and land on the structure, or, for example, into the mulch around the structure. How do building materials ignite, and things like that. So Phil, the next slide, please. So I'll give one example of one of the projects that we're working on, and that's what we call the emberometer. So one of the problems that Arnaud mentioned is firebrands, and research has shown that at least 50% of structure ignitions in communities, and some numbers say up to 90% of structures ignite because of firebrands. And the reason is because we don't adequately understand firebrands and how they ignite structures. So we're interested in using STEM to do some experiments and measure and actually quantify the firebrands as they land on different combustible materials. And so that's the goal of the project, is to design and fabricate a device to measure firebrand exposure. And we call this an emberometer as a play on embers and thermometers or things like that can be used to measure things. Next, please. So here's a little concept picture for it. We want to design a device that is affordable, deployable, controllable, and quantifiable. Affordable because we want to have many of them, and because they might get destroyed. We're putting them hopefully in a hazardous location. We want to get close to the fire so we get good measurements. And so we're using things like consumer grade cameras, which are affordable. And we can use many of them. Deployable, we'd like to send it out into the field. Controllable, we see a little remote control guy there, and he can stand in a safe location and control the device, which has multiple cameras that videotape the embers as they fly past. And quantifiable, we want to know exactly what we're seeing. How big are the embers? How much heat do they have? How are they traveling? How far have they traveled? What kind of fuel are they coming from? And so all of these things are in consideration for this device, which all comes together. And we'll see an example of that in the lab on the next slide. This is the output. So we have 4 cameras that look at a single area. And this picture is showing in blue the different traces of individual embers as they pass through the camera. And each one in here is numbered together, and we can take 4 simultaneous views of each individual ember and then recreate what the ember looks like to measure the size. So on the next slide, please. In the lab, we've done several experiments where we create our own firebrands, which you can see flying, glowing on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we see the measurement. So the camera is watching, and it's tracking each individual firebrand as it travels through. And so we know the trajectory of where they're going. And then on the next slide, we'll see what happens when we take that information and reconstruct them. So in the top left, we see all the different paths that the firebrands took. And the arrow is pointing to a graph, which shows us the rate of numbers of firebrands that are going through at each time in the red line there. So we see there's peaks and valleys in terms of the numbers, and that's what we saw in the video there. And so with this, we can count how many there are and how fast they're coming, and hopefully how much energy they're bringing to the area. And then on the right side, we see example of, on the top, a reconstructed piece. So the video cameras together go through some processing, and we see that we've identified a stick type shape here, and we know how big it is and what shape it is. And we can compare that to some of the firebrands that we collected, which we see on the bottom right there, as all the black squares are burned embers that we collected. And so by comparing those, we can do the quantification that we are looking for to get accurate measurements of how big they are. So on the next slide. How can we use this? Okay, so we've measured these firebrands. How can we use it? And so we're hoping to use it in laboratory experiments. So as we are doing our other project right now, where we're burning small structures to see how they can ignite neighboring structures if they're too close together. They also generate firebrands, which go and can ignite more structures on fire. And so, for example, in the lab, we can measure the firebrands we generate there. But then we'd also like to take it into a real fire and measure the true exposure. So what to better implement science in the building codes, we need to know what we need to design for. How strong of a fire do we need to protect against? And until we measure that in the field, we just have our best engineering guess. And so our hope is that by collecting this data, we'll be able to do that. And so we'll be able to define the firebrand exposures, how many there are, how big they are, how much energy they have, and then improve construction guidance and materials science. And so with that, ends of my section.
Sorry. Okay, thank you, Eric. Now, Peter and Arnaud have a presentation, and I will call up their slide. Just give me one moment. I'll take myself out.
Phil, we lost your audio. Please stand by. We'll be right back. Welcome back, Phil.
Okay, thank you.
We hear you now.
All
Good.
right, let me get your screen back.
Okay.
Hold on a second. This is not good. Shoot.
Philip, would it help if I share my screen?
No, it's Google Chrome has locked up on me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but I could share my screen and do my presentation.
Yeah, you can. Why don't you go ahead and do that?
Okay.
Hopefully Google will clear itself shortly. I apologize. We're having technical difficulties.
Okay, can you see my screen?
No, I can't see your. No. Shoot.
Okay.
This is not good.
Well, Phil, I can go ahead without slides. Sometimes that's
okay. Yeah. Why
more
don't you
dynamic
talk?
and interesting.
Yes.
Okay, so but let me know anytime if you get your
Right.
system running again. So I'm Peter Sunderland from University of Maryland. First, I want to thank you, Eric, for that outstanding talk. Every time I hear you talk, I'm inspired, and it's great to see the U.S. government doing research at the very highest levels, really on important topics. So in our department now, it's the smallest department at University of Maryland. We have 3 full-time professors who are doing tenured type of research. And so I have 3 brief topics I want to talk about just to introduce the research that we're doing on our campus. So the first one let me do is my research, and I'm also interested in these firebrands. As Eric said, between 50 and 90% of the structures, the houses that are burned in a wildland fire are ignited because of the firebrands. What happens is that these tend to spiral around and pool in small areas. A single firebrand, like a stick, is unlikely to burn down someone's house. But what happens is you get dozens of these sticks that are burning that pile in one area and then can burn down the deck, which usually then results in loss of the house. So the emberometer is fascinating to me, and we're working on an enhancement perhaps down the line where that can also measure the temperatures of the firebrands using very inexpensive cameras similar to Eric's cameras. And so by taking a picture of these embers and looking at the colors, we can actually convert that to temperature. And we've been doing it so far with stationary embers. And next, we're starting to look at embers that move by. And what we're very pleased about this is that in the past, everyone used a thermocouple, attach a thermocouple to the surface and measure the temperature. And this was quenching the reaction and missing the temperatures by 200 degrees C. So we're finding the true temperatures are about 200 degrees C hotter than what everybody thought before. So that's my research on pyrometry. The next one I want to talk about is Arnaud Trouvé, who gave a good introduction to the topic at the top of the hour, and he's doing wildfire spread modeling. So my research is mostly experimental. Of course, you always analyze it. This is STEM after all. And Arnaud Trouvé's research is mostly numerical. So he uses detailed computational models to simulate flames in ways that when you look at the simulations, sometimes you have to scratch your head and say, is that an experiment? Is that a picture of the flame? Or is that a numerical simulation, kind of like a video game that he's able to make of these flames? So in his models, he's actually able to input the topography and the geometry of a community and predict how the fire will behave. In the past, this has really been done by the Weather Service. They say, we need to be the ones to predict these fires and analyze them. We know all the winds aloft, all the temperatures and humidities. And, they have a good point. But at some point, when you get down to the scale of the fuel actually burning, these weather people aren't so good at that. And here's where Arnaud Trouvé is best in the world and can do these simulations and actually get more realistic understanding and prediction and investigation of these fires. And so this research is funded by National Science Foundation, also here in the Washington metropolitan area, and has really been, I think, transforming how the world looks at these types of simulations. And then the third one I'm going to talk about is Professor Stoliarov. He's trained as a chemist, but he's working with Arnaud and me in the Department of Fire Protection. And he's got a project now sponsored by NIST, by Eric's organization, to look at what happens when these firebrands land on a piece of wood, for example, or plywood or OSB board. And so what happens is he cooks a bunch of firebrands. There's just small wood dowels, and when they're glowing red hot, pours them onto a piece of plywood in a small wind tunnel, because there are always winds in these situations. And he's looking now at what it takes to ignite the wood, and how many firebrands it needs, what velocity of wind, and what kind of wood will actually ignite. And the hope is that he can improve the codes and standards and also the construction practices to use wood that's more resistant to the ignition, and also to learn about the effects of the wind. There are some surprising results he's finding. For example, at very low wind velocities and very high wind velocities, you don't have ignition, but it's only in the middle range actually that the fuels ignite. And so there's a lot of surprising results coming out of that. And I've gone a little bit quickly through this, but I'm ready to hand the baton back to our next speaker. Thank you. Well, let me keep going then, since I seem to have the
Hold on, I'm seeing if I can enter this way.
Phil, if it's okay, I'm going to go on to my other slides, and feel free to interrupt at any time, okay?
I'm back, but I don't know if I'll be able to access the slides. Yeah, I apologize. So,
if you need another minute, I could present my other
yeah,
materials.
go ahead, President.
And Phil, you have an echo. There may be two mics on you. So the other topic I want to talk to about today is education, and specifically in our department and the undergraduate program in fire protection engineering. So if you're interested in STEM, that capital E in the STEM is about education and engineering, sorry. And so we have the only undergraduate program in fire protection engineering in the country. There are lots of STEM fields you can major in if you're interested in learning about fire and studying fire, but certainly one you'd have to consider is ours in fire protection engineering. So we're, as I mentioned, the smallest department on campus. That does make for a nice community when you're in a big campus and sometimes feel lost, that you're always coming to classes that are small, and you really have a chance to get to know all your cohort, your instructors, and your co-students. So we're the only program in the United States, really in the world, that's accredited that has an undergraduate program in fire protection engineering. And one thing that's really exciting to me about this field right now is that there's so much room for technology to come in and help with fire protection engineering, not just for wildland fires, but all types of fires. So we have really good scholarship and support if you're interested in applying, especially if you're on this call. I think you're probably interested, and just want to encourage you to contact us or apply to our program. So we offer the Bachelor of Science, Master of Science, Master of Engineering, which is without a thesis, and a PhD through mechanical engineering. And Arno will talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Our students, they study fire suppression, structural protection, egress, smoke control, fire detection, lots of exciting topics where we are using your physics and math to understand and make the world a safer place. We're the only major with protection in the name of the major. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Phil.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I apologize for this technical difficulty. Lance, I guess Lance, you were next with your video. I think I can still show your video. Do you want to introduce it?
The Maryland Forest Service doing a controlled burn or prescribed fire on some state property for an ESA, which is an ecologically sensitive area or significant area, depending on how you want to word it. And I think it's for the frosted elfin. It's on the eastern shore of Maryland, and like I said, it's about 5 minutes in length. You can go ahead and show it if you want, though.
Every ecosystem obeys a natural fire regime. This means that wildfires will follow a naturally occurring pattern of frequency in which they occur. The eastern shore of Maryland has a fairly infrequent fire regime due to its unique ecosystems that thrive off of a complex river system along the Delmarva Peninsula. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the eastern shore's marshlands, maritime forest, and river ecosystems have provided a diverse landscape for a variety of native plant and animal species for decades. Since wildfires don't regularly break out on the shore, fire management teams have been using their own methods of burning to imitate this natural occurrence so that the ecosystems can thrive.
Historically on the Delmarva Peninsula, fires would burn naturally probably about every 7 to 10 years. And so for a long time, people didn't let fires burn naturally, and that leads to a buildup of fuel wood on the forest floor. And then when you do have a fire, it can be a lot bigger. And so most foresters now, fire management is a big part of their jobs now, and depending on where you are in the country, they try to have prescribed burns in areas that mimic the natural fire regime in those areas.
These man-made fires are known as prescribed or controlled burns. According to the National Fire and Aviation Management, prescribed burns can reduce hazardous fuels, recycle material back into the soil, remove invasive species from the environment, and much, much more. The eastern shore's marshland in particular is home to many native species that benefit from the frequency of these prescribed burns.
We have an awful lot of large grasses, and when the grasses grow really, really large, especially in the fall, they're very tough, and any of the new grasses that try to come up have to really fight their way through. So by burning the marshes and getting rid of all that top growth and letting the ash settle down and compost, then that leaves basically not really exactly bare ground, but bare enough for the new grasses to come up so that they have all new foliage and it's not fighting with the old stiff foliage there.
In order to pull off these burns, it takes a large team of trained, experienced professionals to safely execute this process from beginning to end. Fire specialists have a large amount of planning to do before a burn can actually take place.
I write what's called a burn plan, which goes over what the weather conditions have to be in order to do the burn, how much help I need, where any sensitive areas are to smoke or any environmental areas, how many people I need. Then I come out with a bulldozer or whatever and put in the control lines in order to do the burn, and then just wait for the weather. And then when the weather's right, I send out and try to get the crew together and come out and pull the burn off.
The weather plays the biggest role in the safety of this process. Due to the unpredictability of weather conditions, fire management teams often don't know if a burn will take place until the day before it's scheduled to occur. Specialists must make sure that the weather conditions are near perfect before ever laying fuel to flame.
If the humidity is too high, the fuels won't burn. If it's too low, it'll burn too hot and too hard to control the fire. Same with the winds. The winds, you want some wind, but not a whole lot of wind. You want wind to move the fire, but you don't want a lot of wind to blow the fire across your line. The air temperature has to be just right. If the air temperature is too hot, then you get too much of a kill, and you kill too much that you want to burn.
Another key safety tool implemented by fire management teams is the use of control lines. These are lines created around the objective burn site that leave only material that cannot catch fire around the burn perimeter.
By doing the control lines with either the bulldozer or using a natural road, what we're doing is we're taking the fuels away. So the fire burns up to that dirt, because dirt doesn't burn, and the fire goes out because you're taking the fuel aspect away from it. Now, if we use water to extinguish the fire, we're taking the heat away from the fire.
Many people may think that setting an entire forest on fire sounds counterproductive to the regrowth of habitat and rejuvenation of an ecosystem. But prescribed burns are actually incredibly beneficial to the surrounding environment.
The positives of the burn are you get new growth, you get browse and cover for the deer and the animals. Any trees that die are usually still standing, so you have bug habitat for turkeys, for quail, for deer. If you look at an area that's never been burned, it looks sort of like a pine tree desert, where there's just pine trees and no new growth underneath of it. Where if you look at some of this stuff, if you come back in 6 months, it looks like it's got warm season grass, it's got cover, it's got all kinds of habitat for animals, and a lot of different plants are able to grow because we open up the canopy to let more light in, and we burn off the duff layer so that the seeds can get down to the soil to germinate.
These prescribed burns may seem extreme at first sight, but the benefits to the ecosystem are quite clear. This is just our way of mimicking Mother Nature's natural process to help preserve and enrich the habitats that are so valuable to us. When the smoke clears and new grasses begin to bloom, there will only be a flickering memory of the site of fire on the shore.
Christine, did you want to talk about your topic, even though I can't get you the slides?
Yeah, sorry, just unmuting. Yeah, I can try and do that. So, hi everyone. I'll talk a little bit about what I do as a fire engineer. So you guys just heard a lot about research and kind of what's being done to advance the field of wildfire. I work in California as a wildfire risk engineer. So I'm a consultant for those who live in the wildland urban interface and would like to reduce their risk from wildfire. So over a fourth, even up to a third of the population of California lives in the wildland urban interface. California itself has areas on maps that show where you're in a very high hazard zone. And if this is the case, there are additional codes in California that you have to apply. So just in general, I think I'm trying to picture my slides. So there's many scales that you can apply mitigation measures. So, we apply at a building scale. We'll look at residents. We'll look at hospitals, any sort of buildings that might be in the wildland urban interface and how we can fix that. But it's not just a building scale problem, right? So wildfires come from forests. They come from kind of the mountains and high topography, and they come and impact all of the community. They impact cities, they impact counties. So as wildfire specialists, we're not just looking at a building scale, we're looking at community scale, city scale, and even regional scale. So we need to apply everything. When we do look at a building scale, we're looking at a few things. We're looking at vegetation management, so how kind of just on that property, how we can manage vegetation. So within 0 to 5 feet, we typically say no combustible materials. From 5 to 15, we say limited combustible materials, so some vegetation. And then from 30 to 100 feet, we say, you can have a bit more combustible materials, but the idea is to really just reduce the fuel load. So if you reduce the fuel load away from the facade of your home or a residence or any sort of building, then you're increasing your mitigation and your resilience to wildfire. Another thing that we think about is home hardening. So we think about what materials are being used for the property. So are we using, non-combustible roofs? Are we using siding that is non-combustible? Are we putting vents over screens so that embers, like Eric talked about, can't come and catch and ignite your home from there? So we think about kind of that level. And then we also think about kind of just if we're consulting at a building level, just if they're prepared, if they understand the communications, if they understand fire department access, and what to expect during a wildfire. So if we apply to community and city scale, then we start thinking about the infrastructure, power supplies, where and how fire department is accessing the space, where they should prioritize their efforts. And so that's kind of when we get more, and we work with city planners, we work with fire department themselves. So there's a lot of different stakeholders kind of at work in the mitigation space. So one of my slides, I talked a little bit about all the risk controls. So, it's a long list, but, we think about ignition sources, we think about wildfire hazard and risk mapping. So understanding where you are in your risk. Just an example, we think about smoke control and ensuring that people understand their risk from smoke, especially during escape. We think about infrastructure, power supplies. One important one that we think about is education. So we want to make sure that people understand where to go, how to communicate, and how to understand their risk, and then also how to leave, how to be prepared, having a preparation kit potentially ahead of time. So these are all things that we think about. One of the examples I was going to give is a project that I recently worked on, which is a community wildfire protection plan for the city of Malibu, which is just north of LA, where I am now. This was a project where Community Wildfire Protection Plan is essentially a plan that you get government state funding. They want every community to do this type of plan, but they think about it from a community scale. So what areas can we treat for vegetation management, like that video you just saw for prescribed burns? What would be appropriate to apply some of the prescribed burning, but then also critical infrastructure. Where is it? Is it well protected? And what are escape routes? How are people managing kind of their zones? So if there's egress zones and fire department says, zones 1 and 2 will evacuate, do people understand that and do they trust that? So Malibu was hit by a major fire, the Woolsey fire in 2018. So that actually made the CWPP process a little bit more difficult because a lot of people had opinions, pretty strong ones, about what should happen for the process and for the mitigation measures. So there was kind of this aspect of trying to build public trust. So the process included identifying risk, working with the public, and working with the local fire department and all the different stakeholders involved, and just aligning kind of the goals with any sort of competing goals and any sort of just general planning goals for the city of Malibu. So that's just an example of a project I worked on. So I think with that, I'll just turn it over to whoever is speaking next. And you guys, I think we're going to do questions at the end.
Oops. Hold on a second. Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what I'd like to do now is I'd like to end the broadcast. I think it was a good show, but obviously there's some technical problems. So what I plan to do is, well, first let me end the broadcast and then we'll talk. So I appreciate everybody for staying with us. We've had some technical problems, but we will put together a full broadcast. We'll be posting soon. And again, check out our website for the listing of all the events. Hopefully this is the only one that has technical problems. So thank you everyone who joined us tonight and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.